So we're going to be talking about tier 0, 1, and 2, and how we can protect accounts, especially in tier 0, and what we should do, what we shouldn't do, what some of the attackers are doing, what we need to look for, and some of those concepts. If you do have a question as we go through, please raise your hand. We'll try to dive into as many questions as you have along the way. This is a good email for me, so if you come up with a question afterwards and you want to ask me, please. I have 21 MVPs from Microsoft, and part of that is I try to help the community as much as I can through speaking. I probably speak at, 15, 20 events a year. I'm prolific on LinkedIn, and just try to help the community as much as possible. A little bit more about me. I've been around this space for quite a while, as my 21 MVPs kind of show that. I've written, I was trying to count the other day. I think I've written 16 books over the years. So I pulled a couple out of the archives. This Securing Windows, Server 2003, not a good seller. But my claim is the Group Policy Resource Kit. Many of you may have that book. The great thing about the resource kit is what is contained in it. Which kind of was luck. I was working for a company in the early 2000s named Desktop Standard, which you've probably never heard of before. And then in 2006, Microsoft acquired all but one of their tools. The tools that Microsoft acquired became Group Policy Preferences. And the one tool that they didn't obtain that became a new company, you may have heard of it, Beyond Trust. So kind of an interesting little diversion there in history lesson about what happened with Desktop Standard and those tools. As I mentioned yesterday, some of you were probably in my session. I was very lucky from 2014 to 2020, I worked for Manage Engine, and so I got to travel the world. I think I went to probably 40 countries in that 6-year span throughout the world, and it was pretty awesome to be able to travel the world and experience different cultures and whatnot, all talking about Active Directory and Active Directory security. So that was pretty awesome. Anyway, that's a little bit about me. Let's get started. So what we want to do is we want to define what an admin really means, especially within an Active Directory environment. I get this question a lot from auditors. Auditors kind of don't fully understand the concept of Active Directory and security, and they think it's, there's an easy button. With Active Directory, I don't believe there is an easy button. Active Directory is kind of shotgunned in where things are hidden and how things are defined. So we'll try to break this down. We'll also talk about how you find those admin accounts. I now work for a company called GuidePoint Security, and I do a ton of Active Directory security assessments. And this is certainly a huge part of what I do, is I go in and I try to find all of the administrative accounts to make sure that there aren't too many, make sure that those accounts are privileged properly. If an account shouldn't be there, I flag it, and I try to dig out as much information as possible around those accounts. Then we'll talk about the tiers, and then we'll talk about why the tiers are important, and if you break tiering, what potentially could happen. And then we'll talk about best practices for tiered accounts. What is an admin account? Well, an admin account for me is a privileged account. Okay, now privileged also is a little bit kind of murky in what it means, but I kind of look at two types of accounts within an Active Directory environment. You have a standard user and then a privileged account, right? And I want to have as many people standard users as possible, right? Thank goodness now we have technologies that allow just-in-time access, just enough access, so we can elevate privileges as needed and give it only for a certain amount of time, which is something I encourage everyone to get in your environment. We want everyone, even administrators, to be standard users most of the time, and only when they need to perform a task that requires privileges to be elevated to that, right? So what are some different ways that users get privileges? Well, of course, we have the default admin groups, right? Domain admins, administrators, enterprise admins, even group policy creator owners is a privileged group, obviously, because we can create GPOs. But that's not the only way that users can get privileges. Many times I find that that's what an auditor will look at, but we really need to go beyond that. Because when we look at the attacker is certainly going beyond that. Most of our organizations are tracking the default admin groups, so an attacker doesn't want to be found that easily. So an attacker is going to go look at other means and other ways that people get privileges, so now they can go after accounts that maybe aren't being tracked, and maybe even the organization doesn't know that they have privileges, right? So for example, user rights. So if we dive in and look at user rights, I'm going to go to group policy, and I'm just going to crack open the default domain controller policy here. Go to my policy settings, Windows, security, local, and user rights assignment. Okay, a couple of things about user rights, okay? And I feel this is extremely important because of the nature of how Active Directory gets created and then how things get pushed out. So when we look at a default installation of Active Directory, there are 2 default GPOs, and there's 1 default organizational unit, okay? We have the default domain policy, which is linked to the domain level, and then we have the default domain controllers policy, which is linked to the domain controller OU. Now this is, in my opinion, extremely important point. So when a server becomes a domain controller, it is automatically placed in the domain controller's OU, thus receiving what you see on the screen. So what you see on the screen is default. Microsoft has defined inside of the default domain controller's GPO user rights so that when a server becomes a domain controller, it is hardened in a certain way, okay? And that's automatic. But when a server joins Active Directory, it is placed in the computer's container, thus only receiving the default domain policy, which has 0 user rights configured in it. So that means when a server joins Active Directory, it only has the default user rights that it had at install. It doesn't receive any hardening from Active Directory because it joined Active Directory. So I highly recommend when you look at your servers, which is tier 1, that you evaluate the user rights on that machine. Because I'm going to guess that there are some user rights there that you do not want certain users to have. For example, the biggest one, who has the ability by default to log in locally to a server? Who? All users. All users can walk up to any server if you hadn't hardened it and log on to that keyboard. Okay? I don't think we all want that. Now, granted, you probably have your servers locked and blah, 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 but that's not the point. The point is we want to make sure that we are hardening our machines as best as possible. So those tier 1 computers aren't receiving the same security by joining AD that a domain controller does, which is tier 0. Okay? Now, in order to actually kind of pull this information out, we'll kind of intermix some of our stuff here. My recommendation is to use a tool called SecPol. I love SecPol, right? One, it's on every single Windows machine. So I don't need to install anything. And SecPol tells me exactly every single time what is configured on that machine. The problem with SecPol is you can't use it remotely. That's the problem with SecPol. But when I perform deep and wide audits and assessments, I always use SecPol. So SecPol gives me what appears to be a very much a group policy type view. And if I come over here to my local policies, again, typical structure, I have my user rights. And so what I can do at this point is I can actually right click and I can export this list, and I get a text file of what the user rights are configured on this machine right now. I don't care where the setting came from. I just want to know who has what privileges on this machine at this time. Okay? Now, a couple of things about user rights and as well as other ACLs, and I know user rights isn't an ACL, but it's a configuration that allows for, let's see, allow log on locally, for example. This is, the user rights are for the entire machine, okay? So if I, for example, have the ability to back up files, I can back up any file on that machine, even if I don't have permission to that. So user rights are actually more powerful than access control lists, because user rights are referred to as privileges over that machine, and it's a higher level of privilege than an access control list. But when I go through and I look, the one thing that I look for immediately, are there any individual users listed in user rights? And I flag them every single time. Because if you think about how many workstations, servers, domain controllers you actually have, and if you have an individual user listed, are you really going to remember, oh, I need to go in and remove that user because that user doesn't need that privilege over that server anymore? No. Most of us don't even look at user rights. So certainly we're not going to look at an individual listed on user rights. So I encourage you to go look at your user rights, especially on your key servers, on your domain controllers, and evaluate, is this correct for all of these settings? There are some pretty important settings in here. There's about 35 individual user rights settings that give users a ton of privileges. All right, so that is user rights. Then we have Active Directory delegation. Now, Active Directory delegation is extremely important, right? It's one of the key factors way back when I, was getting everyone, encouraging them to move away from Windows NT to Active Directory. AD delegation is extremely important. Unfortunately, Microsoft still hasn't given us a reporting tool for this. It's brutal, right? Any of you that have dealt with AD delegations, trying to figure out how you can give someone very limited access, it's not that easy, okay? Now, of course, the global settings are easy, but there aren't that many of those. So delegation is one of those things that we refer to now as shadow admins, because they're in the shadows. We really have no idea who has what, okay? Now, AD delegations are truly nothing more than an access control list. They're just permissions, but they're pretty beefy and they are pretty complicated as well. So if I go back to Active Directory, and let's say, for example, let's see. Okay, so I have some groups here, right? Let's say that I want to give someone the ability to modify these groups, and only these groups. So what I can do is I can come in here and I can right click and I can go to the Delegate Control Wizard, hit Next, and then I add, it says users, but we don't want to do that, right? No users on individual ACLs. We want to add a group. So let's say that I add my help desk group to have the ability, to modify the membership of a group, and I'm done. Pretty easy to set. Now, how do I report on it? That's a whole nother beast. How do I remove it? Can I go through that wizard and select objects to remove? Nope. So I want you to think about the history of your Active Directory environment, okay? I was just right before the session, a guy that I used to work with at Tenable, Clement, just wrote an amazing article on Windows 2000 Trust. I encourage you to go look at it, okay? Basically what he found was Windows 2000 trust relationships, which could still be around, right? Because you could have installed Windows 2000 and upgraded all this time. those trusts are missing a particular flag, which make them look like an external trust, which means it's behaving in a totally different way than an internal trust. But think about the early 2000s, right? We didn't care about security. Many of us were studying for an MCSE. And of course, what was the best place to kind of learn Active Directory? Well, at work, in the production environment, right? So how many people in the early 2000s were poking around in Active Directory and they're like, oh, man, I see this option here called delegate control. I wonder what that does. And they went through and they clicked and they set something like, oh, it must not have worked. So they did it again, right? And so now you have all of these configurations in Active Directory that weren't supposed to be there. They're almost impossible to dig out, but they're there. And easily an attacker can go through and determine who has privileges over what parts of AD and what they can do in Active Directory. It's also a great place for persistence, backdoors. So when an attacker gets into the environment, they can go in and establish delegation. Because most SIEMs that I have seen certainly don't have rules looking for permissions being set on Active Directory objects. And most SOC analysts would have no idea what to look for anyway. Delegation, permissions at the OU and object level are extremely complicated. And they really don't even make sense when you look at the details, okay? So I encourage you to go in, and in a minute we're going to go through and I'm going to show you how I dig out permissions and delegations in Active Directory. And then finally, another option is I have group policy delegations. Very similar to Active Directory, but I can give someone the ability to link GPOs, modify GPOs, create GPOs, and of course, you virtually can do anything with group policy to a domain controller, to a server. You can give yourself privileges. You can make all of these configurations in a group policy object. So we also have to go in and consider that someone can be an admin or have privileges because they can modify group policy. It was interesting. I was listening to a conversation after the last session. I was sitting in the back, and they were talking about group policy, and I believe, and I don't know what the exact context was, but he said, group policy doesn't work. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't think you're doing it wrong. Group policy does work. It's extremely powerful. Now, it may not work the way you think that it works, because there's a lot of little details in group policy which make it kind of complicated. But certainly group policy is something that an attacker wants to gain access to and they want to leverage. All right, so how do we find admin accounts? Well, let's first of all talk about these groups. And I'm going to expand kind of what I talked about with the default privilege groups, and I'm going to push you to look at more than just the default groups. And here's why. What I see in most organizations is that at some point in the lineage of Active Directory, the administrator, the domain admin, created additional groups and put these groups inside of these default groups. And they're actually using these new groups to provision privileges within Active Directory. They're not actually putting them in domain admins. They may be putting them into some other, standard admin group. I don't know what it's called. So what I encourage you to do is document all privilege groups and monitor all of them. So you have the default groups, you have these custom groups that I'm talking about, and then a third category of privilege groups are what I call service and application groups. When you install a service, when you install an application, it creates groups in Active Directory, and those groups are either given user rights or they're given privileges over that application or service, and those are privilege groups as well. And so I encourage you to put all of those groups into some monitoring system so that you can monitor these privilege groups, and when someone is added or even when someone is removed from those groups. And that way you can track it. Okay? Because we all know, sure, you have a ticketing system, but, I didn't have time to get the ticket in, I'm just going to go do it, and things happen, right? Drift happens. The other thing is to get the members of these groups. We've all fought with this forever, right? So if I want to come in here and I want to know who has membership in the administrators group, Microsoft has never given us kind of a GUI view of recursive group members, right? We can drill down into this, but that's a royal pain. And then this window isn't scalable and sizable, so it really has never been something that's easy to do. But now, of course, we have PowerShell. And let's see if I have one. There was Snake. The last one? Thank you. Right. So super simple. Get 80 group member, recursive. Obviously, if it has a space, put quotes. And now I can get all of the users down to that user level that's in that group with a PowerShell command. Okay. So again, use these tools, dig this information out, know who your tier 0 accounts are, know who your tier 1 accounts are, because we need to make sure that they are limiting themselves on where they can actually log in. User rights, right? We already went through this. SecPol is great. You can use PowerShell. It's not nearly as good looking as a result, but you can certainly use PowerShell to pull that information out as well. Let's talk about AD delegations. We went through the process of establishing that delegation, but how do we actually report on that? So we were right here at this DLM OU, and the tool that I use is DSACLs, okay? DSACLs is part of RSAT. It's also baked into your domain controllers. But DSACLs, DS stands for Directory Services, and then Access Control Lists. The only complicated part, in my opinion, of DSACLs is you have to understand LDAP syntax. That's really the complicated aspect of this, right? So right here, I'm getting DSACLs for admin SD holder. But easily, I could come in here and I could say OU equals DLMOU, and then I get rid of system, and I have OU equals the OU name, comma, DC equals, basically you put DC in front of each part of your DNS name. And you get the output. Now, it went for a little bit, so it's a little clunky. I will admit to that. But you can throw it into Excel, and now you can look for signatures of those permissions that you're looking for, okay? For me, I look for 3 specific delegations. 1, I look for the ability to reset passwords. So what I do is I go into the OU structure, I look for the OUs that contain the majority of the employees, maybe service account OU, and an administrative OU. Sometimes that could be just 3 OUs. And I run DSACLs on those OUs, throw them into Excel, and find out who can reset passwords. It's really that simple. Okay? So I look for reset password over user OUs. For OUs that contain groups, I look for modify group membership. Okay? Same process. I look for the OUs that have the groups, pull DSACLs, and then I go and I look for those permissions. Finally, I look for the ability to create users and computers within Active Directory. Now, why am I adding the ability to create computers and create users? Well, it was about, probably 3 years ago now. There was a new vulnerability in Active Directory called SAM account name. And basically, I don't know how these attackers come up with this idea. Someone said, I'm going to create a new machine or user with the exact same name as a domain controller, and then I can basically hijack the system. That's the SAM account name vulnerability, okay? So I want to know if someone can create computers There's a couple of ways to create computers, right? One is Active Directory delegation. Two is I can go into user rights, and there's a user right that's add workstation to the domain, which is tied to the, it's the MS, I can't remember the exact term, but it's basically the quota of how many computers someone can add to the domain, which by default is 10. That's an old type of setting, right? Do we really want users adding computers to Active Directory? No. So I suggest you go in and remove that, right? Because it's just another avenue that an attacker can take advantage of and possibly, exploit Active Directory. So that's how I look at AD delegation. Because if you try to go in and look at Active Directory delegation through the GUI, it's just not pleasant, right? So if I come in here, I go to my properties. Well, first of all, Microsoft decided that security wasn't that important at first by default. So when you're an admin and you come into Active Directory users and computers, you don't get to see security. In Microsoft's world, that's an advanced feature. So if I come in here and I look at my help desk group, of course, we're all familiar with the fact that that would be a special permission, right? Because it's not part of any grouping of permissions that meet some of these. So you have to go into advanced. And then here, there it is. Right? And so then I have to come in here to edit. And then we have this wonderful, miserable list that Microsoft converted over to this view, which is much worse than the other view that we had, in order to actually see this. So this is not feasible to audit or report on this in this fashion, which is why I, years and years ago, moved over to DSACLs to pull this information out. And then group policy delegations. Normally what I do for group policy delegations, because I also want to get other information from group policy, here, is I go in to my GPO objects and I save an HTML report. If I can get to the desktop. So it would be this one. And so up here, it tells me who has what permission. And there are some wacky things that you can do with permissions inside of group policy, right? So those of you that have been around Active Directory long enough, remember before we had the GPMC, right? You actually had to go through ADUC in order to actually create and modify GPOs. And then Microsoft ported it over to the GPMC, but the GPMC actually masks in its delegation configuration a lot of the back-end permissions. So if you go into that advanced view, you can set some weird stuff with group policy. But this is actually telling me, what permissions people have around GPOs, right? So this is a way that I pull this information out. And now that I have this huge save report, now I have if there's any modifications to security filtering, and then I have all of the settings as well in a nice report. I suggest you do this not only for checking security, but this is a great way to document your GPOs. In case something goes wild, something happens to a GPO, you have that. Of course, you do want to make a backup as well, but this is just an alternate way of getting that information. So if the backup gets corrupt or something happens with the backup, you can still recreate the GPOs from the report. We've looked at what kind of an admin definition is with privileges. We understand how to pull that information out, so now you can actually document who has all of these privileges in your environment. We talked about your domain controllers are tier 0, your servers are tier 1, and of course the associated privileged accounts that are supposed to deal with Active Directory and the DCs, the servers, are obviously in those tiers as well. So this is a view of the tiering that has been established, tier 0, tier 1, and tier 2. You'll notice that our tier 0 is our domain administrator, our domain controllers, potentially critical servers. tier 1 is our servers, applications, application servers. And then, of course, tier 2 is the rest, our workstations. And the whole purpose of this is we want to define which accounts and which computers are in the tier, because we don't want certain users to log into computers that aren't in their tier. Tier 0, this is our domain admins, enterprise admins, PKI infrastructure, ADFS if you have federation, and your privileged accounts. Then you have your server and your applications and those associated accounts, and then you have end user devices. The Microsoft tiering commandments: credentials from a higher privileged tier must not be exposed to lower tier systems. So we do not want domain admins, which is tier 0, logging on to a tier 1 or a tier 2 computer. We don't want server admins logging on to workstations. So we are prohibiting the privileged accounts to log on to systems that really users are in control of, because we don't trust users. Well, I don't. I don't know if you do, but, right? I mean, it's pretty easy to get a user to do something bad, right? Just send them a kitty cat video and they'll do whatever. I mean, it's kind of crazy what users will do. And unfortunately, a lot of our users just aren't tech savvy and they don't understand, right? Rule 2, lower tier credentials can use services provided by the higher tiers, but not the other way around. And any system or user account that can manage a higher tier is also a member of that tier, whether originally intended or not. So these are Microsoft isms. I found this on some weird Microsoft page, so I thought it was interesting and I put it up here. But in essence, we do not want privileged accounts logging into non-privileged systems. What can happen when we break tiering? Well, when an account logs on to, let's say, a workstation, by default, that workstation is going to cache those credentials. And so now we have credentials, right? The hashed password residing on that workstation. And if someone can get enough privileges on the workstation, they can dump that cache information, and now they can either use the hash, pass the hash, or they can break the hash to get the actual password. This is the whole purpose of tiering, right? What was it, 5 years ago, 6 years ago now? Microsoft came out with the term assume breach. And I think that's a pretty good view of what we need to look at our environments from. Assume someone has breached something in your environment, whether it be a service, whether it be an application. They may not have breached Active Directory, but they have got into something at some point, okay? Now, I have a different session that I pull up the kill chain. And with the kill chain, which is the steps that an attacker takes to enter and then move through the environment, I focus specifically on that breached workstation. Because I typically find when I'm reading about tiering, when I'm reading about workstations and security, what is left out is the attacker needs and wants local admin on the workstation. May not be admin and AD, but they want local admin on that workstation for 2 reasons. 1, they need to install software to enumerate the environment. 2, they want to go into every possible area within that workstation that has cached credentials and pull out those credentials so that they can create a list. And that is extremely important when you start talking about security and tiering. Because if we think about the attacker's standpoint, right? First of all, they installed a tool so they can enumerate Active Directory. What are they enumerating around Active Directory? What do they want to find from Active Directory? Users with privileges. They don't care about a user that doesn't have privileges. They want to get a list of users that, according to Active Directory, have privileges. And if they have local admin, they typically are now a user in that domain. They don't have to be, but typically they are. And then I always show this, most of us know, but for posterity, if I go to the top of my domain and I look at the permissions on who can do what, authenticated users have what permission at the top? Read. Try to get rid of that. Some of you possibly have, carved out certain areas, but if you really want to do damage to Active Directory, deselect that. Because who else is part of authenticated users? Administrators. Yeah, I used to do hands-on classes, and one person every class would go in and deselect that, because we were looking at delegation, and they would go in and deselect that. And then boom, no access to AD. Nothing works. Nothing, because they just locked themselves out of Active Directory. Okay? But the inversion of that, trying to restrict this, is very difficult. Extremely difficult, right? And here's another tip. If you're using a third-party tool to administer AD, great, continue with that, but do not think that because you have this tool that the attacker isn't looking at AD delegation and they can bypass that tool. They don't have to use that tool. You may think, oh, no, I have RBAC configured in XYZ company's tool, so I don't have to worry about delegation. No, you absolutely have to worry about delegation, because there was a time you didn't have that tool and someone potentially set up delegation, or someone set up delegation yesterday. I mean, that tool does not prohibit someone to go to ADUC or use an LDAP tool to get access to Active Directory. It doesn't negate that at all. So make sure that if you are using a third-party tool, you go clean up your shadow admins, because that tool is not protecting that environment. We have the ability to dump LSAS as well as LSA secrets. Now, I'm going to give Horizon Secured all the credit for this. And if you don't follow Horizon Secured on LinkedIn, I strongly encourage you to do it. It's a gentleman from the Czech Republic. He does classes, and he posts some amazing details around Active Directory, and he always puts in screen captures and a great discussion and explanation. And this was actually posted the day before I first did this presentation, so I decided I'm going to throw it in here. But he goes through and he describes exactly how you can basically configure someone that is dumping out the LSA secret. So this is auditing if someone is going to do that. And then what he does is he proves it over here. So he runs Mimikatz and he dumps it, and then he shows that it's a kernel object entry, and you just tracked someone from dumping out the LSA secrets. There are ways to monitor for this, and I highly suggest that you set these things up. Throw these events over into your SOC, because this event doesn't happen that often. So these are perfect types of events that you want to throw into the SOC. Because if it happens, I mean, the big red alarm should go off because something really bad just happened. And you want to be able to track that. The other thing that attackers want to do is, once they get a privileged account, or even if they get this list of accounts that have privileges, or the list of credentials from the caches, they're going to move laterally. And this is also what I really focus on when I talk about that kill chain. So at the workstation level, the attacker needs local administrator. They need local administrator to install a tool to enumerate AD, as well as to pull the credentials out of all the caches, the OS cache, application cache, that browser cache, all of these caches, and they create a master list. Now, think about those two steps. A tool to enumerate AD and a list of usernames and password hashes. If I can find out all of the users in AD that have privileges, that is a subset of all the users. And if that subset of users matches any of these users, it's game over. Nothing else has to occur except for crack that password hash. That's it. So this is an extremely important point. And so what the attacker does is they get all of these cached credentials and they take the first one that they have, right, the administrator, and they move laterally to the next workstation to get all of its cached credentials, and then move to the next one and the next one and the next one to create a master list of all cached credentials. So that if one admin breaks tiering, it's game over. It only takes one. And the attacker is gathering all this information. So the concept of lateral movement is very important because the attacker wants to move and gather as much information as possible, looking for that administrator account. They never touched really AD except for to run a couple of queries. That's it. They're not trying to break into AD. They're just trying to get cached credentials and then it's done. Super easy. Now, how easy is it to break into password hashes? Pretty easy anymore. It was about 3 years ago, I sat in a session from a gentleman that worked at the NTT group, and he was talking about a server that they built specifically for this test, right? It was a $20,000 server. Really not that expensive. And they threw tons of video cards to get that memory speed from the video cards. I think it was 20. They pooled 20 of them in there, which is the cost of the server. And they could break nearly any password in 4 hours. The hash. Crazy. Because they were also using certain algorithms in their cracking to look for certain signatures, right? Starting with a capital, ending with an exclamation or some special character. All of these permutations that users use for passwords, it was baked into that process to look for these signatures and look for, to break those passwords. It was amazing. There's another company out of Germany that has password cracking capabilities that are super fast. And of course, we don't even have to build a server anymore. We just go buy cloud space, right? You know, you call up AWS, you know, how much do you need? A lot. For how long? A day, right? I don't need it forever. I just need it until I crack all the password hashes and I'm done. So lateral movement is a very important aspect. But it also goes back to that workstation and that user or that attacker wanting local admin to get all of those cached credentials so they can then move laterally and look for that one. Password extraction, we talked about that. The data exfiltration, in my opinion, this is really difficult to track. Now, if I'm pulling a ton of data, or I'm using an account that never touches data, right? I probably can have some type of DLP or other intrusion detection system that's going to flag that. But if I'm just looking at normal behavior of a normal user pulling data at a normal rate, how are you going to find that? How are you actually going to trigger that? So this is where that attacker has that upper hand, and they're looking for certain signatures of certain accounts so that they can use those accounts to pull this information out. Denial of service attacks, it's not really the norm anymore, right? Attackers don't want to be noticed, right? They may go to the level of ransomware, but the denial of service, no, I want you up and running. I just have your data, I'm gonna sell it. So denial of service attacks are there, it's possible. I think there was one here yesterday, right? Because not only was this hotel had no Wi-Fi, 2 hotels down didn't have Wi-Fi either. I think someone mucked with the entire Wi-Fi environment on the whole block. Because the Wi-Fi here came up at the exact same time as the Wi-Fi 2 doors down. Kind of shocking, I don't know what happened, right? What was fiber? Someone cut the fiber? No. And then we have malware deployment, right? So now this goes back to that group policy delegation, right? What's the best way to deploy malware? I don't know, let's use a tool that's deploying software, right? Group policy's baked in, or maybe I'm using a third-party tool. So I want to break into that. I want to basically have it deploy everything for me. I don't want to do any work. I want it to do all the work for me. Privileged accounts have access to lower tiers, right? So this is where we have account takeover. And then we have this concept of backdoors. I encourage everyone in here to scour through the most common backdooring in Active Directory and make sure you know what is configured, you know your risk, and that way if anything drifts, you can monitor that and you can trigger off of that, okay? Let's talk about some of the most common backdoors in Active Directory. So let's come down to, let's see, Maximus has a lot of bad configurations, right? So let's talk about one of the first ones, which is primary group ID. You will notice this user has a primary group of domain admins. That is not normal, okay? So what I always do in every assessment is I run a query, users with a primary group ID not set to 513, and I get that list. Let's kind of decrypt this primary group ID. So if I go back to my user, and let's just pick on a different user, so you can see what it looks like by default, it says domain users. Okay, now if I go into the attribute editor and I go down here to primary group ID, you'll see that it's set to 513. Okay, now we talked a lot about this yesterday in our session. This is the RID of that group. So if I go to the domain users group, which should be here in users, and I go to the attribute editor and I go to the object SID, you will see that it ends in 513. So what the primary group ID does is it takes the RID from the group that you are establishing as the primary group ID and sets it as the attribute, okay? Giving that user that privilege. So if it's a domain user, they're a domain user. If it's a domain admin, they're a domain admin, okay? I find some organizations still use primary group ID. They kind of use it as a variable to track certain users. But what I want to know is if it's set to a privileged group and no one knows about it. Because what the attacker can do, again, this can be an external or an internal person, is they can run that simple query in PowerShell and find every user that has a certain primary group ID, 512, 518, right? All of the default privileged groups, or even maybe Exchange admins. And now they have a list of privileged users, and they got it because of the primary group ID. What I always encourage organizations to do is move accounts that have privileged groups as a primary group ID back to 513. There's other ways to give this. And if you look at the definition of primary group ID, it even tells us it really shouldn't be used much anymore, because it says there is no need to change primary group ID unless you have Mac clients, which that requirement went away in around 2005, or POSIX compliant applications. Does anyone still have a POSIX compliant application? Does anyone know even what the heck it is, right? I mean, this is a way old legacy term. This is like a Unixism way back in the early 2000s, okay? So this setting isn't needed. But the problem is we have humans in the middle of this life cycle management. So it's the year 2002, we have a POSIX compliant application, and we have to go in and configure the primary group ID on a handful of users that need access to that. Typically, it needed to be some admin level. So we configured these 5 users to have 512 as their primary group ID. Fast forward 8 years, it's 2010. We no longer have that POSIX compliant application. Do we go in and change 512 back to 513? Nope, we didn't even remember we did it. So it's sitting there, right? This is that technical debt that we always refer to. This is a perfect example of technical debt. But if you weren't aware of it, are you monitoring for it? Are you even looking for it? No. So if I'm the attacker, I can now come in and I can set my primary group ID to a setting, and now I'm that level of user. And no one's looking for it. Now, what's interesting is if you go through the GUI, you cannot set the primary group ID to a group that the user isn't part of. It won't let you. But we have something called a DC shadow attack using Mimikatz that can. I can put a primary group ID on a user to a group that they currently don't have membership in. That's why we look for these things. That's why we need to look for these back doors, and if someone put in something like this, and we need to go clean it up so the attacker doesn't have access to that. So that's one of them. 2, we need to look at SID history. I don't think I have my PowerShell command to pull out SID history. It's a pretty simple PowerShell command. But let's talk quickly about SID history. SID history is used during the migration. So if I'm going to migrate these users in that domain over to this domain, I'm going to take the users and I'm going to create new accounts over here. Because I really can't take that account, right? Because that account has a SID for that domain. And I need that migrated user to have a SID for this domain. So when I take the users from that domain over here, they have a new SID for their new account. But their resource is still over there. So when this new user goes over to that resource, access denied, because this SID isn't on that ACL. Now, I could modify all those resources to include all of these migrated accounts, but I don't want to do that. So what I do instead is I take the old SID and tuck it into the SID history attribute on the new account. So the new account actually has 2 SIDs, the old SID and the new one. So when the new user goes to the old resource, it shows its old SID, access allowed. But if you've never done a migration and you have users that have SID history, something's not right there, okay? The other thing that I tested just recently is if I have a single domain, does SID history still work? And the answer is yes. I can put a SID for any user into that SID history, even if it's the same domain, and I now am that level of user. So I can, again, we go kind of reverse engineer. I know the most powerful account and what its RID is, right? Administrator ends in 500. I pull that out, I take that, shove it into the SID history. If I've never done a migration, are you monitoring for that? No. Even if you have done a migration, are you monitoring for that? No. So now you have a user. Everything in that account looks normal. You can't even see SID history by default in the GUI. So it's almost impossible to determine if that account has privileges or not, but it's running around doing whatever it wants because it has the SID of the administrator. It is a great backdoor. Okay? So query your domains for all users that have SID history. If you did a migration and the old domain is gone, get rid of SID history because you've re-ACLed those resources when you brought them over. So go clean these things up because these are perfect backdoor techniques that attackers love to use. Next, let's go to Kerberos delegation. So Kerberos delegation is typically for computers, right? But you can also set up delegation for users. There are 4 levels of Kerberos delegation. Now, typically Kerberos delegation is granted to a computer because it's running a service, or it's granted to a user because that user's being used as a service account. And what Kerberos delegation allows is for that object to communicate with other objects bypassing certain channels, okay? The worst is the second radio button. That is called unconstrained Kerberos delegation. It is the weakest of all secured delegation. What I have set up here, this one is protocol transition. So protocol transition basically is allowing any protocol as you see. It's not restricting it to Kerberos. And it is the second weakest. If I move it to Kerberos, that's Kerberos delegation. The fourth isn't even in the GUI. The fourth level of Kerberos delegation is resource-based delegation, which must be configured through PowerShell. I typically look at the first 2 levels. Computers with Kerberos delegation, right? Again, I run these PowerShell commands and just get individual reports so I can quickly go through, and I'm looking for these very targeted configurations so that I can go in and I can remove those configurations from these machines. And somewhere I have one for, that's Kerberos delegation unconstrained is here. All 4 of them can be exploited, all 4 levels. But it's harder as you go down in that chain to exploit the configuration. Next, I want to get users that have an SPN. SPN stands for Service Principal Name. Typically, and as you see here, these are all SQL, when a user account is configured to support a service like SQL, it is configured with an SPN so that it can perform certain activities, okay? Now, you also can see SPNs here. So I think Maximus has one. Oh, we can go here, right? So if I come down here to service principal name, it's just an attribute. But using PowerShell, I get the full list. I get all the SPNs that it's configured for. The issue with an SPN user is it is 100% exploitable and you can't negate it. It's impossible. If a user has an SPN, I can query that user to get its TGT, and then I can get the password from that. You can't stop it. Okay? So, we have levels in which you protect SPN users. 1, if it no longer needs the SPN, remove it. If it requires the SPN, don't give the user any privileges. If for some crazy reason, the service that it's supporting requires that service account to have privileges, make sure that you protect that account and monitor the behavior of that account. First, throw it into a PAM and have the PAM control the password. That way it's nice and long, it cycles through the password, all of that stuff. Restrict that user to only one machine. That way it's a one-to-one relationship. Then you go into that user. Oh, account, there it is. And this is one of my favorite settings right here, the log on to. Because you can specify which machine that user can interact with. So by default, users can log in anywhere, right? So imagine taking the attack surface of a football field, configuring one machine, and now the attack surface is a postage stamp. It's an awesome setting. Plus, built-in documentation. Because I have yet to meet any organization, small, medium, or large, that when I go to them and I say, do you have all of your service accounts documented? No, we don't. Okay? So you have to know what your exposure is. Plus, what I recommend is moving away from users being service accounts and go to group managed service accounts. Because now it's a totally different beast, and now AD is handling the password, and it's just a totally different level of configuration. What other settings would I look for? This is one of my favorite ones. And this is not a back door. This is just one of those things that I encourage you to look for. Users that have never logged on. Now you may be thinking, well, if they've never logged on, who cares? You should care. Still today, I find most organizations, when they create new users, use a standard default password for new users. And the thought process is, it's Friday at 4, the employee starts Monday at 8, it's just the weekend, and the very first thing they do when they log in is they're forced to reset their password. What could go wrong? Right? Except for there's a new project starting on Monday that has 10 employees. So you go in, you create the accounts, give them, provision their group membership, because of course Monday they need to work. And now on Monday, only 9 show up. 1 decided not to work. So does that get back to the admin so the admin can delete that 1 account? No. So I encourage you to run the PowerShell command of users that have never logged on, but be prepared. The list is normally massive. And if you can run the query, who else can run the query? Any other employee. And if the password is still the same as at creation, who knows that password? Everybody. And it's provisioned, so now they can log in as that account and gain access to whatever that user had. And if it was a privileged account, you just gave them the keys to the kingdom. Okay? Now, what I've seen is some mechanisms is I've seen some organizations that actually run this like every 15 to 30 days, and they will reset the password for accounts that have never logged on within 15 to 30 days. Just randomly set the password. That way, those accounts, even though they haven't logged on, aren't using that standard password. Okay? My recommendation is get rid of them. Delete them. We don't want accounts that have never logged on just sitting there, because they do have security ramifications to them. Account creation, right? We talked about this. This is one of those delegations I look for. Users and computers. DC sync, right? This is another great backdoor configuration, because DC sync, I only need 2 permissions at the root level to perform a DC sync. DC sync allows me to create a fake domain controller, have that fake domain controller go to a real domain controller, and I ask the real domain controller for a list of all the users and their hashes, and it freely gives it up because I have the permission to do that. 2 permissions is all I need at the root. So go look for this, because attackers, this is a perfect way to create a backdoor. DC shadow, right? DC shadow attack is when I've got domain admin privileges, and I can do whatever I want throughout the domain using the DC shadow attack. I can create, modify, delete any object in Active Directory. Then, of course, at the top is the golden ticket attack. Pretty difficult to actually monitor this with perfection. There used to be a company that did this. Complex actually had a technology that they could look for a golden ticket attack with precision, meaning they knew exactly when it was a golden ticket attack. Where today, most tools, it's a guess, right? They're looking at certain behavior and putting it together, but it could be a real behavior from a domain controller that they're flagging. But I'd rather flag everything than let a golden ticket attack go by. Best practices: avoid risky configurations. So all of these configurations that we just talked about, go look at them. Only provision these settings when you have to. Go clean up the technical debt that you have for these settings, right? Don't assign too many users to have privileges. And those users that have privileges, use a PIM, right? You use just in time, just enough access. All of these concepts are extremely important when we talk about tiering. Use least privilege, the concept of least privilege. I still find today, and some of you probably fall into this, users are local admins on their boxes. Stop that. There is technology out there that's 20 years old that allows a user to be a standard user, and they can perform any administrative task on that machine at will. But you control it, and the user isn't an admin. There's tons of solutions around this, and they're not that expensive. So don't give users local admin, not even your admins. Use logon restrictions. I showed you that for the service accounts, but you can do it for users too, right? User rights to limit logons. Use user rights to limit what users can do. Log on locally, log on remotely, log on as a service, backup files. All of these things you can configure in user rights and restrict what users can do. Implement MFA. I'd like to say go passwordless, but that's really a pie in the sky dream. But use MFA wherever possible. Is it a royal pain? Yes, I hate MFA, but it gets you a certain level of security to help protect your environment. It doesn't protect the identity. We had this conversation yesterday, but it at least in certain environments helps protect against the attacker coming in. And use third-party solutions with authentication and access policies. For example, I do a lot of work around NTLM and Active Directory. I try to remove NTLM version 1 if possible. That's a very difficult task to track and actually implement. But there are tools out there that actually can track all NTLM authentications and give you that list so you know exactly who is using NTLM. Usually it's service accounts from a legacy application or service. And then if that's the only account, there are tools that you can create rules that say no one can use NTLM except for this one user. But that one user can only use it from point to point. Done. Some awesome technology out there for that. So if you're interested in that, I may ask you some questions around what you're really looking for because each tool has its own little uniqueness, but I can point you to some tools that can help you kind of reduce some of this for authentication and access. You also have authentication policy silos, which this is part of this flexible authentication secure tunneling fast, which is known as Kerberos armoring. So in essence, these are a couple of GPO settings. The settings right here. So you can actually go in and set up additional levels of controlling the Kerberos behavior. And now you're moving to that even next level of tiering, right? To where now you're protecting the account, not only restricting, but now you're protecting that account in certain behavior. You guys have my email. It's right there. If you want the PowerShell commands, please email me and say, hey, give me the PowerShell commands. If you want the deck from me, because I don't think I've given it to 1105 yet, email me and say, hey, give me the PowerShell commands in the deck. I'm more than happy to send you that information. If you have any questions, utilize me, right? If I don't know the answer, I know a lot of other people that know more than I do, and we can get you answers on stuff that you're dealing with around Active Directory, group policy, Windows security. Question?
So Derek, you mentioned that you should change the passwords for users that are inactive. What about just simply disabling the account?
So the question is, do I change the password for accounts that have never logged on or are inactive, or do I just disable them? If the account is never logged on, I would change the password and disable it. Just because if I re-enable it, now I know the password, right? So I'm using that layering of security, right? But again, delete it. If it's never logged on, just delete it. Now, if it's inactive, that's another beast, right? Because that account, I don't know, maybe they're on maternity leave, maybe they're on, sabbatical. I don't know where they are. And some companies have different, life cycle management. I'm dealing with a pretty large organization now. In 21 years, one purge out of AD. One. They have over 900,000 user accounts. Okay? Many of them are disabled, right? But they keep them. It's just their policy. So you never know, what someone's going to come up with. And for me, if that account hasn't been used in 2 years, delete. Right? Just delete it. You can always get it back. They have some awesome tools that they can recover things. So if I need to recover it, I can go to that tool and recover it. I just don't want it sitting there in AD ready to go. Yes?
I have 2 questions. What about periodically changing your password? Where do you stand on that? And what if somebody's already got their digital cached at the moment? Like say I've logged onto a user machine with my credentials as an admin. How do I just change my password and that solves it for a second?
Okay, so let's take the first one. I do not agree with Microsoft or NIST on their password requirements, and actually NIST last month changed theirs, okay? Go look up the new NIST recommendations on passwords. They're no longer saying it doesn't matter, because you know what? It matters. My recommendation, passwords should be 15 characters or longer to break NTLM. And if I can get a user and the company to approve a 15-character password, I'm going to give it to them for a year. But I really want it to cycle at some point, okay? Service accounts, you throw them in a PAM and let the PAM take care of it, right? Your second question is, if I, as an admin, log on to a workstation, right there, stop, don't. Just don't. Oh, what if you already have? You want to go and wipe out caches, right? So there's a GPO setting that allows you to set the cache, the number of cache credentials. You can set that to 0, and it will wipe those out. But you also want to go and make sure that those credentials are wiped out. So you'll probably have to run PowerShell and wipe out all those, because it's not just the OS. You want to wipe out browser and all the other caches as well. Okay? Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Have a great rest of your day, and hope to see you at the next Tech Event. Thanks.